Picture this. It's 1881, and there's a photograph sitting on a desk in Munich that's about to destroy a kingdom. Not just any photograph, we're talking about the most scandalous image in European royal history. In this photo, a Hungarian actor is sitting confidently in a chair, while the king of Bavaria, yes, an actual king, is standing behind him like some kind of servant. Now, if you know anything about royal protocol, you know that kings don't stand while commoners sit. Ever. It's literally unthinkable. But this photo didn't just break protocol. It shattered a carefully constructed lie that had been 20 years in the making. And when copies of this image started circulating through the royal courts of Europe, it set off a chain reaction that would end with 2 dead bodies floating in a German lake and one of history's most mysterious murders. This is the story of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the man they called the Mad King, and how one forbidden photograph exposed the most dangerous secret a 19th century monarch could possibly have. Now, if you've ever been to Disney World, you've seen Ludwig's castle. Neuschwanstein, that fairy tale fortress perched impossibly on a cliff, was Walt Disney's direct inspiration for Sleeping Beauty Castle. Every year, over 6 million tourists climb that mountain to take selfies and buy postcards. But here's what they don't tell you on the guided tours. That castle wasn't built for fairy tales. It was built to hide the darkest secrets of a king who literally reversed time itself to love who he couldn't love in daylight. Every tower, every passage, every hidden door was designed with one purpose: to conceal activities that, if discovered, would mean death. And when those secrets finally came to light through that single photograph, the most powerful men in Bavaria decided that their king had to die. But let's start at the beginning.
Because Ludwig's story doesn't begin with murder. It begins with first love and first heartbreak in the golden halls of Munich's royal palace. It's 1863, and 18-year-old Crown Prince Ludwig is everything a future king should be. Tall, classically handsome, intelligent, and already showing signs of the artistic temperament that would define his reign. He's hosting a reception in the throne room when Prince Paul von Thurn, on taxis, walks through those massive doors. Paul is everything Ludwig has never allowed himself to imagine. Dark-haired, confident, with eyes that seem to see straight through the layers of royal protocol to something deeper. According to Ludwig's own private writings, something electric passed between them the moment their eyes met. Not the polite recognition of one royal meeting another, but something far more dangerous. What happened next was supposed to be impossible in the rigid hierarchy of 19th century European nobility. Late-night visits became routine. Hidden letters, passionate and desperate, were exchanged. Letters that somehow survived in the royal archives and paint a picture of a young prince discovering not just love, but a love that could destroy everything he was born to become. But palace walls have eyes, and servant corridors have ears. Whispers began spreading through the court like wildfire. Ministers started taking careful notes. The Queen Mother, Marie, watched her son with growing alarm as he spent more and more time with this magnetic young prince from a rival noble house. The relationship couldn't last, of course. Royal mothers in the 1860s didn't tolerate their heirs falling in love with other men, especially not other princes who could potentially use that love as political leverage. Queen Marie intervened with the cold efficiency of a woman who understood exactly how dangerous this liaison had become.
Prince Paul was quietly transferred to Prussia under the pretense of advancing his diplomatic career. He never returned to Bavaria. Ludwig never saw him again, but the damage was done. In his private diary, Ludwig wrote that this was the moment he learned that love for him would always mean loss. The 18-year-old prince, who had been known for his early morning energy and enthusiasm for court business, suddenly began avoiding daylight. Morning meetings were postponed. Afternoon audiences became the norm. The transformation had begun. And then, just 1 year later, everything changed forever. King Maximilian II died suddenly in 1864, and 18-year-old Ludwig found himself wearing the crown of a kingdom that had existed for over 700 years. The Wittelsbach dynasty needed an heir, needed continuity, needed their young king to marry well and produce sons to carry on the bloodline. The pressure was immediate and crushing. Every advisor, every minister, every relative had opinions about which European princess would make the most suitable queen. The choice eventually fell on Princess Sophie Charlotte, younger sister of the famous Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Sophie was everything a queen should be: beautiful, intelligent, cultured, and genuinely fond of Ludwig. By all accounts, she would have made an excellent queen and probably a loving wife. In 1867, their engagement was announced with great fanfare throughout Bavaria and across Europe. Wedding preparations began immediately. Guest lists were drawn up, including every major royal house on the continent. Sophie began planning her wardrobe, her household, her future. But something was wrong. Ludwig kept postponing the wedding. First, it was moved back a few months for scheduling reasons. Then another postponement for political considerations. Sophie, who was no fool, began to understand that her fiancé's heart lay elsewhere. Finally, in what must have been one of the most painful conversations in royal history, Ludwig confessed to her that he simply couldn't go through with the marriage. He couldn't love her the way a husband should love a wife. Sophie's response reveals both her grace and her understanding of the impossible situation. How could I marry anyone else after being loved by Ludwig? But here's the thing that the official histories always gloss over. Ludwig hadn't been talking about loving Sophie when he said he couldn't love her properly. He had already fallen completely, desperately, dangerously in love with someone else. Someone whose very existence in his life could bring down not just his reign, but his life. His name was Richard Hornig, and their story began in 1866 when this blonde, blue-eyed young man arrived at court as a stable groom. Now, in the rigid hierarchy of royal households, stable grooms were about as low as you could get on the social ladder. They mucked stalls, fed horses, and occasionally got promoted to helping with the royal carriages if they were lucky and competent. But Richard Hornig was something special. Classical features, an easy smile, and the kind of natural confidence that made him stand out even in a crowd of palace servants. Ludwig noticed him immediately. What happened next was unprecedented in the history of the Bavarian court. Within months, Hornig went from stable groom to master of the horse, a position that would normally take years to achieve and require significant noble connections. Then he became Ludwig's personal equerry, which meant constant access to the king's private chambers and inner circle. The gifts started flowing: property, a salary that dwarfed what most nobles earned, jewelry, art, unlimited access to the royal household. Ludwig gave Hornig a private name that he used only in his most intimate letters, De Galipa Minosila, which translates roughly to the beloved of my soul. But Ludwig's private writings from this period reveal a man torn apart by internal conflict. Passionate love letters to Hornig alternate with desperate prayers for forgiveness and descriptions of self-flagellation sessions where he would whip himself raw for his unnatural desires. One diary entry, discovered decades later in a hidden compartment of his desk, shows the depth of his torment. I am damned, but damnation with him is sweeter than salvation alone. This wasn't just a king having an affair. This was a deeply religious man, convinced that his very soul was at stake, but unable to give up the one person who made him feel truly alive. And it was around this time that Ludwig made a decision that would define not just his reign, but architectural history itself. He was going to build a castle, not just any castle, but a medieval fantasy fortress perched on an impossible cliff face that could only be reached by a single bridge, a bridge that could be destroyed at a moment's notice if unwanted visitors approached. Neuschwanstein wasn't built as a tourist attraction or even as a proper royal residence. It was built as the ultimate hiding place, designed with secret passages connecting the bedchambers, hidden doors that allowed servants to move unseen, and rooms specifically designed for activities that could never take place in the public areas of traditional palaces. Here's something they don't tell you on those Disney-inspired tours. The throne room at Neuschwanstein is magnificently decorated with gold leaf, precious stones, and artwork that cost more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. But there's no throne. Ludwig never installed one, never intended to conduct royal business there. The castle wasn't built for ruling, it was built for hiding. And as construction progressed, Ludwig's own schedule began shifting to match his need for secrecy. By 1875, the transformation was complete. The King of Bavaria had become the Night King. His official day began at 7 in the evening. He ate breakfast at midnight, lunch at 3 in the morning, and dinner as the sun rose. He conducted all royal business in darkness, met with ministers by candlelight, and created a parallel Bavaria that existed only in the shadows. His carefully chosen companions, Hornig, young theater actors, musicians for private concerts, lived in this nocturnal world where normal social rules didn't apply. The crown jewel of Ludwig's shadow kingdom was the Venus Grotto, an artificial cave built into a hill near his castle. This wasn't just some romantic garden folly. We're talking about a full-scale underground lake with heated water, colored electric lights that could change the mood from red for passion to blue for melancholy to green for jealousy, and mechanical wave machines that created the illusion of an underground sea. To power all this, Ludwig built Germany's first electrical power station. The entire Industrial Revolution was harnessed for one man's need to create a world where he could love freely without fear of discovery. And if unexpected visitors arrived, the lights could be extinguished instantly, plunging the entire grotto into darkness and making it appear as nothing more than an empty cave. But secrets, especially royal secrets, have a way of leaking out despite the most careful precautions. By 1880, disturbing reports were reaching the ears of Munich's political establishment. Ludwig's servants were chosen not just for their discretion and loyalty, but increasingly for their youth and physical attractiveness. They were paid extraordinarily well, far beyond what any servant could expect, but the money came with requirements that went far beyond traditional duties. A vengeful valet, dismissed for reasons that remain unclear, provided testimony that he described as detailing performances that would shame a Roman emperor. According to these accounts, young male servants were required to perform private dances in Ludwig's chambers. Not just any dances, but performances where the young men wore nothing but flower garlands, while Ludwig watched from his throne-like chair, occasionally calling individual dancers forward for what the testimony described as private instruction. The reports were filed carefully in ministerial archives, but they were kept secret, for now. The political establishment wasn't ready to move against their king, but they were certainly keeping careful records of everything they heard. And then, in 1881, Ludwig met the man who would seal his fate. József Kainz was a 23-year-old Hungarian actor performing with a traveling company at Munich's Court Theater. He wasn't particularly famous, wasn't considered a great talent, but something about his performance that night captivated the king completely. Ludwig, who rarely attended public performances anymore, had watched from the royal box with an intensity that made everyone around him uncomfortable. After the final curtain, he sent word that the young actor was to be brought to his private chambers immediately. What followed was a private audience that lasted until dawn. When Kainz finally left the palace, he was carrying an invitation to join the king on a private journey to Switzerland. They traveled under false names, Ludwig as Count von Berg and Kainz as his secretary, staying in luxury hotels and behaving with a freedom that would have been impossible in Bavaria. And it was during this Swiss interlude that the photograph was taken, the fatal image that would destroy everything Ludwig had spent decades trying to protect. The setting was innocent enough. A photographer's studio in Lucerne, the kind of place where wealthy tourists went to commemorate their travels. But the image that emerged was anything but innocent. József Kainz sits confidently in an ornate chair, one leg crossed over the other, looking directly into the camera with the kind of easy assurance that suggested he knew exactly who he was and what power he held. Behind him, Ludwig stands with his hand resting protectively on the back of Kainz's chair, his entire body language screaming devotion as he gazes not at the camera, but lovingly down at the young actor. In that single photograph, every carefully constructed lie, every elaborate deception, every secret passage and hidden door became irrelevant. Here was the King of Bavaria, clearly and undeniably in love with a male commoner and looking proud of it. When copies of that photograph reached Munich, the political establishment went into crisis mode. For decades, they had been willing to look the other way, to pretend that Ludwig's eccentricities were harmless royal peculiarities. But this image was undeniable proof of what everyone had suspected, but no one had been willing to confront directly. Count Holstein, a former friend who had become Ludwig's political enemy over various policy disputes, saw his opportunity and seized it with both hands. Holstein began systematically collecting evidence. The photograph, of course, was the centerpiece, but he gathered servant testimonies, receipts for lavish gifts to young men, stolen excerpts from Ludwig's private diaries, and detailed accounts of the nocturnal activities at Neuschwanstein and the Venus Grotto. But Holstein was smart enough to know that accusations of homosexuality alone wouldn't be enough to dethrone a king. In 19th century Bavaria, even the most conservative nobles understood that royal sexuality was complicated and that discretion was more important than absolute conformity. What Holstein needed was to prove that Ludwig was mentally unfit to rule.
Enter Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, Bavaria's most prominent psychiatrist and a man with his own political ambitions. Dr. Gudden had never met Ludwig, had never examined him, had never even been in the same room as the king. But that didn't stop him from writing a detailed medical report declaring Ludwig mentally incompetent. Every eccentricity, every artistic passion, every unconventional decision was reframed as evidence of dangerous mental illness. The nocturnal schedule became evidence of delusions. The elaborate castles became proof of megalomania. The private relationships became symptoms of moral insanity. It was medical malpractice on a grand scale, but it was exactly what the conspirators needed. By early 1886, the perfect storm was brewing. Ludwig's debts had reached 14 million marks, an astronomical sum that was bleeding the Bavarian treasury dry. His relationships with young men were becoming increasingly difficult to hide, as servants talked and political enemies gathered evidence. The photograph had been circulating quietly through European courts, creating diplomatic embarrassment and political vulnerability. Something had to be done, and the Bavarian political establishment had decided that their inconvenient king had to go. On June 10, 1886, Ludwig II was officially declared mentally incompetent and unfit to rule. His uncle, Prince Luitpold, was named regent, and a commission was dispatched immediately to Neuschwanstein to take the king into custody. But Ludwig had loyal friends who tried to warn him. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, who had remained fond of him despite his broken engagement to her sister, arranged for carriages to be waiting at the border. Escape was possible if Ludwig could bring himself to take it. But where does a deposed king go? What kind of life exists for a man who has been Ludwig II and is suddenly nobody? According to account, from that final night, Ludwig sat in his study staring at that fateful photograph of himself and Józef Kynes, perhaps realizing that this single image had destroyed not just his reign, but his entire world. When the commission arrived at 4 a.m, they found him waiting in the main hall, fully dressed and seemingly resigned to his fate. And then came the moment that would define the entire conspiracy. Dr. von Gudden, the man who had declared Ludwig insane without ever meeting him, finally came face to face with his supposed patient. Ludwig's response was devastatingly simple. "How can you declare me insane when you have never even examined me?" Dr. Gudden's reply was equally revealing. It was unnecessary. The documentary evidence is overwhelming. Think about that for a moment. A trained psychiatrist was so confident in his political diagnosis that he didn't think an actual medical examination was required. Ludwig was taken to Berg Castle, officially for treatment, but everyone understood it was imprisonment. The deposed king seemed broken, defeated, going through the motions of daily life without any of the passionate energy that had defined his reign. But on June 13th, just 3 days after his arrest, something changed. Ludwig asked Dr. Gudden to accompany him on an evening walk around Lake Starnberg. It was a reasonable request. The doctor had been preaching about the therapeutic value of fresh air and exercise. What happened next remains one of history's greatest mysteries. They left the castle at 6:30 in the evening, Ludwig and Dr. Gudden, with strict instructions that they were to be back by 8 o'clock. Dr. Gudden was so confident in his control over his supposedly insane patient that he dismissed the guards who were supposed to accompany them, saying they needed no protection from a broken man. When 8 o'clock came and went, without the IRA return, search parties were organized. By 10 o'clock, both men were found floating face down in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg. Here's where the official story gets very interesting, very quickly. Within hours, not days, not weeks, but hours, the authorities had reached their final conclusion: murder-suicide. Ludwig, driven by the final stages of his madness, had killed Dr. Gudden and then drowned himself. Case closed. No further investigation required, but the physical evidence told a very different story. Ludwig's pocket watch had stopped at 6:54 p.m. Dr. Gudden's had stopped at 8:10 p.m. That's over an hour's difference, which raises the obvious question of what happened during that missing time. Dr. Gudden's body showed clear signs of a struggle: scratches on his face, nail marks, and what appeared to be strangulation marks on his neck. Ludwig, supposedly in the grips of homicidal madness, showed no injuries whatsoever. Both bodies were found in waist-deep water, but Ludwig was a strong swimmer, and the water wasn't deep enough to drown someone by accident.
Most mysteriously, the first autopsy report mentioned Ludwig's coat having what appeared to be bullet holes, but that coat mysteriously disappeared before anyone could examine it properly. The autopsy was rushed, the bodies were buried within days, and all physical evidence was either destroyed or classified as state secrets. But there's another piece of this puzzle that the official investigators tried very hard to ignore. Jacob Little was a local fisherman who claimed to have been on the lake that evening. According to Little, who was initially dismissed as an unreliable witness, he saw the king in the water but very much alive, apparently trying to reach a boat that was waiting offshore. Little claimed he heard a gunshot, saw Ludwig's body go still, and was immediately approached by men who threatened him into silence about what he'd witnessed. To ensure his cooperation, Little began receiving mysterious payments that continued for years after the incident, payments that came from sources he was never allowed to identify. Little's private papers, discovered decades later, contained a signed confession describing exactly what he saw that night. According to his account, Ludwig wasn't committing suicide. He was trying to escape. Someone was waiting to help him flee Bavaria, probably to start a new life somewhere his sexuality wouldn't mean a death sentence. But someone else was also waiting, someone who had decided that even a powerless, discredited former king was too dangerous to let live. The question that haunts this story isn't really who killed Ludwig II, it's why. If he was truly the broken, insane man that Dr. Gooden claimed, what threat could he possibly pose? A madman's ravings about political conspiracies and secret lovers would be easily dismissed. But what if Ludwig wasn't insane? What if he was perfectly sane and in possession of information that could destroy other people's careers, other people's reputations, other people's lives? Think about it. Ludwig had spent 20 years moving in the highest circles of European nobility. He knew everyone's secrets because everyone had felt comfortable sharing them with the harmless, eccentric king who spent all his time building castles and staging private operas. What if Ludwig knew which other nobles shared his sexual preferences? What if he had evidence of other high-ranking officials' involvement in activities that would be just as scandalous as his own? A living Ludwig, even a deposed Ludwig, would always be a potential source of dangerous revelations. A dead Ludwig could never testify about anything. The cover-up began immediately and was executed with military precision. Ludwig's private papers were seized and burned. Servants were dismissed with generous pensions that came with strict non-disclosure requirements. The Venus Grotto was sealed and remained closed for years under the pretense of renovations that somehow never quite finished. Richard Hornig, Ludwig's great love, vanished from court records entirely. No forwarding address. No pension records, no trace of what happened to the man who had been at the center of the king's emotional life for over a decade. Joseph Kynes, the young actor whose photograph had started this entire catastrophe, never performed in Bavaria again. He returned to Hungary and spent the rest of his career refusing all interviews about his relationship with the king. When he died in 1910, his personal papers were burned according to instructions he had left in his will. Whatever secrets he might have revealed about those Swiss hotel rooms and private photography sessions died with him. Even today, more than 130 years later, some files related to Ludwig's death remain classified by the Bavarian government. In 2007, historians petitioned for their release, arguing that enough time had passed for full transparency. The petition was denied, with officials stating that the documents were still considered too sensitive for public consumption. What could possibly be so sensitive about a supposedly insane king's death that it requires secrecy more than a century later? The most likely answer is that Ludwig's murder wasn't just about removing an inconvenient king. It was about protecting a network of powerful people who had as much to lose as Ludwig did if certain secrets became public. The photograph that triggered everything wasn't dangerous because it showed Ludwig with a male lover. It was dangerous because it showed Ludwig looking happy, confident, and completely in control of his faculties. It was proof that the Mad King narrative was a lie designed to justify what was essentially a political assassination. But here's the ultimate irony in this entire tragic story. The castles and fantasies that Ludwig built to hide his secrets have become Bavaria's greatest tourist attraction and economic engine. Neuschwanstein alone generates over 50 million euros annually for this regional economy. The Venus Grotto, that once hosted secret midnight gatherings, now sees thousands of visitors every day. The king who spent his life hiding in darkness has become one of history's most visible and celebrated monarchs. Millions of tourists walk through Ludwig's secret passages, photograph his hidden chambers, and buy postcards of the very rooms where he conducted the relationships that ultimately cost him his life. They see the beauty, the artistry, the romantic fantasy of it all, but they miss the desperate tragedy underneath. They miss the story of a man who literally reversed time itself, turning night into day and day into night, just to create a few hours when he could love and be loved without fear. Empress Elizabeth, Ludwig's almost sister-in-law, perhaps understood him better than anyone else in the royal family. After his death, she made a statement that cuts to the heart of everything. They killed him not because he was insane, but because he was free. In a world where kings were expected to be symbols rather than human beings, where royal sexuality was a matter of state policy rather than personal choice, where love was always secondary to political necessity, Ludwig had committed the ultimate crime. He had tried to live authentically. The real tragedy of Ludwig II isn't that he was killed for being gay. It's that he was killed for being free, for refusing to accept that his crown meant giving up his heart, for building a world where he could be himself, even if that world only existed in stolen nighttime hours, for daring to believe that even a king might deserve love on his own terms. In those carefully hidden hours between sunset and sunrise, in those secret chambers connected by passages that servants couldn't see, in those moments captured in that forbidden photograph, Ludwig II of Bavaria lived more truthfully than most kings Eve. Our dare, and that truth, that freedom, that authentic human love, that was what the powerful men of his time found absolutely unforgivable. That was why he had to die. The Mad King Ludwig wasn't mad at all. He was just free. And as history has shown us time and time again, freedom, true freedom, is the one thing that power can never tolerate.